Hello, I'm Charlie Frost, and on this episode of the 24MX Workshop, I'm going to show you how to change your brake pads on your dirt bike. Knowing when to change your brake pads is very crucial. Enduro, motocross, it differs. I personally change my brake pads maybe once every month. Motocross is more intense, so you probably want to change your pads maybe every 2 or 3 weeks. But also in enduro, we go through a lot of harsh conditions, sand, grit, mud, water, all that sort of stuff. So for enduro riders, we change our pads probably once a month or so. But knowing when to change them is crucial. By looking at the pads themselves, you can see if they've worn down quite a lot or not. But for us, like I said, I change mine maybe once a month, depending on what races I do. So now we're going to remove the front wheel to change the front brake pads. There are 2 different ways you can do this. So for instance, on here, because there's no disc guard, you could actually just remove the caliper itself. So you would remove the 2 10mm bolts, and you can remove the caliper and then change the pads that way. Or the sort of more ideal way, should we say, is removing the front wheel, leaving the caliper in place on the fork, and then change the pads that way. So I'm going to demonstrate to do it that way, but there is 2 options you can do. So we're going to do it the more strategic way, and we're going to remove the front wheel. So we're going to need the pads, and we're going to need a 10mm socket and a 24mm socket to remove the front wheel spindle. So using the Proworks front brake pads, what we're going to do, now this is a bit of a techie tip. I learned this myself years ago. Because obviously the front brake is still engaged, when you remove the front wheel and then put the wheel back in, the disc needs to go between the pads. But because the pistons are still pushed against the pads, it's going to be quite tight to get the disc in between the pads. So what I do is I just push my knee against the caliper, like so. You're going to put pressure on it and push the caliper back against the wheel. So what that does is it pushes the pistons back into the caliper. So what you'll see in this sec is now the pads have opened up, so there's more space for the disc to go back into. So just a little tech tip, if you do remove the front wheel, it makes life a bit easier. So now we're going to take the front wheel out, remove the spindle, and then obviously change the pads. But you'll be able to see in a closer shot how we do the pads in the caliper. So first we're going to slacken off these 2 10mm. So the way it works is you've got 4 10mm bolts to either side of the fork. Now, the 10mm bolts this side, they clamp the spindle. So when you remove these 2, what that's doing is that's freeing up the wheel nut. So if you were to try and undo the wheel nut now, with those 2 still done up, it'd be very tight. So if you undo these 2 10mm bolts first, leaving these 2 done up, it clamps the spindle that side, but releases pressure on the wheel nut. So undoing this wheel nut will release pressure on here, but the spindle will still be clamped the other side. If you undid all 4 of the 10mm bolts and tried to undo the wheel nut on the spindle would turn with it. So we're going to do these 2 10mm first. Not all the way, just a few turns so it's nice and slack and loose. So that's those 2. And then we're going to change the 10mm for a 24mm. Now on the beaters, obviously the wheel nut is a 24. I think on KTM's Husqvarna Gas, I think it's a 27mm. But like that, and then slacken off the wheel nut. So now what we can do is we can remove this wheel nut the whole way out, because obviously we need a spindle to come all the way out of the fork. So put that to one side. So now we're going to swap back for the 10mm. So now that these 2 are undone, we're going to go to the other side and slacken these 2 10mm off, which then means that we can release the wheel spindle from the wheel. Same again, just a few turns. They don't need to go out all the way, just enough to slacken off the spindle. So now what you've got is you've got the 10mm all loose, all 4 of them, and we're just gonna hold the wheel, because obviously if you pull the spindle out, the wheel's just gonna drop. So we're gonna hold the wheel with one hand and just pull what we've got here is a quick release spindle puller. Most bikes have nowadays. It just makes life easier to pull the spindle out. So as you can see now, hold the wheel, pull the spindle out, easy as that. So we're going to put the wheel and spindle to one side. I don't want to put the spindle back in the wheel, because sometimes you can end up losing the spindle if you kick it along the floor. So we can put that to one side. So now, as you can see inside of here, as I said to you earlier about pushing the caliper against the wheel itself, I've now created a bigger gap to get the disc back into. If I hadn't have done that, those pads would have been much closer together like that. And as you can imagine, trying to get your disc into that gap would have been a bit of a nightmare. So what we're going to do now is we're going to remove the pad pin. So the pad pin is situated behind this flathead screw. So we're going to remove the screw. Sometimes this can be quite tight on there, but luckily it's not. So like that. Please don't lose that. It's a little grub screw. So we're going to put it somewhere obvious so you can see it. And then in behind here is an Allen key bolt. The Allen key bolt is part of the pad pin, so it goes the whole way through the pads to hold the pads into the caliper. So we're going to get the Allen key and remove that bolt now. Now pulling the pin completely out should release the pads. Now if you have a look inside the caliper, you can see the two pistons. Now as I said earlier about pushing the caliper with your knee, those pistons will be further out, which means the pads will be tighter. So we've pushed those pistons back into the caliper, so it gives us more space to play with to put the new pads back in. I put the first pad in and line it up like so, and then I put the pin back in, and then you can see that it passes through the hole at the bottom like that. So you know that that's lined up nice and square, making sure the top part, because as you can see on the end, it's got like a little lug part. So that sits up in this clip here. So if that's not sat up in there properly, you could lose the pad or it could fall out mid-race. So you've got to make sure that that lug is sat nice and square up in there. So like I said, the first pad is in, pretty straightforward. Second pad, like so, making sure that pin pushes through. And then we're gonna get our Allen key socket and then do the pin back up, making sure that's tight. And then as you can see here, obviously you can use a screwdriver, but we open the pads up. So now you can see there's a nice gap for the disc to go into. So if we hadn't have pushed our knee against the caliper, those pads would probably be sort of more like that. And you try and get your disc into that gap whilst trying to hold the wheel, put the spindle in, it's all a bit of a mess. So if we open those pistons up, we've got more space for the disc to go in between the pads. Not forgetting as well, like I said on the beaters, a little grub screw. This basically just stops the dirt and crap from getting into that Allen key head. So it's just like a protective cap, if you want to call that. I'm going to pop that back on there. Bit fiddly because it's really small. Doesn't have to be tight because you end up cross-threading it. But just so it covers up the Allen key bolt head. So now you've got the pads in place. Very straightforward, just going to repeat. Almost do the reverse effect. Now I'm going to put the wheel back into place, spindle back in, and like so. So make sure the forks are nice and lined up, because if you've got your fork twisted, obviously you're not going to be able to put the spindle in straight. So making sure both forks are nice and lined up. So it just makes life easier when you put the front wheel in. The spindle should go in nice and freely, which we're going to find out now. So wheel, spindle. I mean, people, depends on how clean and dirty. If it's got a lot of dirt and grime on it, or like little bits of grit, I would recommend cleaning it. But this is fairly clean, as you can see. So I'm not going to bother. We're going to put the front wheel. This is a crucial part, which I said, if you have a look in here. So we're going to slide the wheel back in between the forks. Like I said, making sure we get that disc sat nice and flush between the brake pads. Sometimes it can be a bit of a task, but that's got in nice and neatly. And then line up the hub with the fork leg, push the spindle through. This can sometimes be a bit of a faff, but no, it's not. Into the second fork, making sure the spindle has gone the whole way through. Now there's different ways you can tighten the fork, leg, wheel up, whichever you want to do it. I was taught this way, it makes sense, and it's worked for me for the last 20 years. So now that the spindle is in place, what we're going to do, I mean, you can tighten both of them up, but the way I do it is I tighten up these two 10 mils. So these 10 mil bolts, we're going to tighten up. So that's going to clamp the spindle itself. So when the spindle is tight, that means that when we do the wheel nut up on this side, when you do the wheel nut up the correct way, it's not going to spin the spindle at the same time. So we're going to tighten these two 10 mils first. You can do just one if you want to, but I've always just done the both of them. They have to be mega tight, it's just enough to hold that wheel spindle. So now that that side is tight, we're going to put the wheel nut back into place. Now this does need to be tight now, so you need to make sure, and when you do this, not silly tight, you should really torque your bolts and nuts, whatever, but certain jobs, like for me personally, torquing your forks is very important because the suspension, that's the way it works. But most bolts like this, I've just done them tight, never had any problems, so I'm just going to do them what I would call tight. Just enough that it doesn't come undone. So now that that wheel nut is tight, we're going to go back round and slacken these two 10 mils off, and I'll tell you why in a sec. So now that those two 10 mil bolts are loose, all that's done is it's basically released the forks, because sometimes when you put the front wheel into the bike, if you tighten them up out at sync, sometimes your forks can get twisted. So for instance, let's say your forks are straight, if you weren't sort of quite lined up, the right fork leg could be twisted. So what we do is we slacken off all the 10 mil bolts, but making sure that the wheel nut is still tight. And then in theory, you should take the bike off the stand, push the forks up and down. But I've always just done it so that now that the pads aren't engaged, that wheel will spin nice and freely. So what we're going to do is we're going to spin that front wheel, I'm going to pump the front brake, then that will align the caliper in between the fork, and then the other fork will line itself up. So we're going to spin that nice and fast, don't catch your fingers in the wheel. Pump that front brake, as you can see, pretty easy. So now we know that the front brake is working. And then just the last job is tighten the 4 10 mil bolts up, and then job done. So we're going to start from this side again. We're going to go left to right, so these two first. Again, not stupidly tight, but tight enough that they won't come undone. That's that side. Right. Like that. And just to double check, I mean, I do this most times anyway. We're just going to double check both the caliper bolts are tight, because sometimes I have heard stories that the caliper bolts have come undone or come out, and then obviously your caliper flies off during mid-race, and that's the last thing you want. So again, just going to check these two 10 mil bolts on the caliper, so they're nice and tight. And that's a pretty straightforward way of demonstrating how to change your front brake pads. Like I said, there is 2 separate ways you can do this. In this scenario, we've obviously taken the front wheel out and done it what I'd call the pretty straightforward way. But you can also just remove those 2 bolts and take the caliper off and do the same job. Probably quicker, but I like to obviously sometimes service the front wheel spindle. Like I said, if it's got grit, sand, or any sort of dirt on the spindle, sometimes you can obviously give it a clean off whilst you're changing the front wheel over. Also, just checking the caliper itself, you can get more of a clearer vision on what's inside. Sometimes you might not notice some damage in there, or like I said, some grit and stuff. But that's a pretty basic, straightforward way how to change your front brake pads. So now that we've changed the front brake pads, we're going to spin the bike around and change the rear brake pads. So now that we've prepared the bike, we're going to replace the rear brake pads as such. So what we're going to need for this job is a 27mm socket to release the wheel nut, and a flathead screwdriver again to release the grub screw, and then an Allen key to remove the brake pin. So the first job on this is to slacken the wheel nut. So from our Proworks socket set, we're going to use a 27mm socket to loosen off the rear wheel. Taking that wheel nut the whole way off. Now again, same as the front wheel, I'm going to push my knee against the caliper to open up the gap between the brake pads. So as you can see now, we've got a much bigger gap between the pads to put the new wheel and disc back in. So now we're going to knock the wheel spindle through the wheel, but we're going to remove that spacer first. So we'll knock the spindle through with the mallet. Going to pull the spacer out of the way so we don't lose it. Knock the last of the spindle through. And on the other side, I mean, there's different ways you can do this. I tend to push the wheel forward first, and then remove the chain off the sprocket, which makes it easier when you pull the wheel out, because if the chain's on the sprocket, it becomes a bit of a faff. So we'll pull the wheel spindle out of the wheel, releasing the wheel itself. Obviously just making sure you don't drop the front of the bike off the stand. Pretty straightforward, same job as the front, just removing the brake pads, brake pin and grub screw. So now we're going to remove the grub screw for the brake pin, so with a flathead screwdriver. Again, don't lose the grub screw because it's really small. So put it somewhere we can see it, but I'll probably end up kicking it by accident. And then Allen key bolt to remove the brake pin again. So with the Proworks socket set, we're going to slacken that one off. So what you'll see now is, same as the front, when I pull the pin out, both pads will then drop out. Nice and easy. As you can see, the piston inside the caliper, because we've pushed our knee against the caliper, it's pushed the piston back inside, giving us more space to play with to insert the new pads. So put the old ones to one side, and then we're going to insert the new Proworks sintered brake pads, which is a new product. Then pretty straightforward, we're just going to reverse what we've just done. So put the right hand brake pad in first. Again, we've got little lugs at the top end, so making sure they sit into the brake clip at the front, because if we don't do that, they could fall out whilst we're racing around. So we hold that with one finger, and then with the pin, we're going to slide it back through just over halfway. The first pad is held in place. Same again with the second pad, making sure the lug is in at the other end, which sometimes you can get wrong. Push the pin the whole way through, and then with our socket, do it back up. Again, making sure this pin is done up nice and tight. And as you can see, we've got loads of gap here now, because where we've pushed our knee against the caliper, the disc has got a lot of movement to put the wheel in. And then finally, the little grub screw. Again, this is only a beta modification. KTM Gas, Husqvarna, they don't have this, but it's quite a good little feature, I think. Stops some muck and mud from getting in the Allen key head. Again, not too tight with that, because you don't want to round the thread off. So now, like I said, we've got plenty of gap here, so new pads are in place. We're going to get the rear wheel and slide it back in to the swing arm. Again, getting our spindle. You can lube them up. I choose not to, because sometimes if you lube the spindle up, it collects all the dirt and grit and it just makes it dirtier. So we're going to put it back in dry. So this can sometimes get a little bit fiddly, because you've got to try and get the rear wheel into place without knocking the caliper. But again, getting that disc between those pads. So spindle in first, making sure it lines up with the caliper holder, and then chain on first, because obviously we need to make sure that the spindle isn't the whole way through, otherwise you won't have the slack. So as the chain's on now, pull the wheel back into place so it's nice and tight, making sure the spacer is the right way round. For the adjuster, push that the whole way through, and over to this side, we're going to put the spacer into place, and then the wheel nut. Now, another little tip that I do, just get any size spanner, doesn't matter, or a screwdriver, for instance, but I just use a spanner. Like I said, 30 mils, quite a standard one. So when I do the wheel up now, obviously it's crucial that the spacers are pushed up against the adjusters. So a good way of doing that is, before the wheel is tight, just putting a spanner into the sprocket and then pull the wheel back towards you. What that does is it pulls the wheel forward, so the spindle and the spacer touches the adjusters like that. Only so far, so it's nice and tight. So obviously, as you can see, the chain is tight, which means now the wheel has been pulled forward. So what we can do is do the wheel up with the spanner in place, so we know that that wheel is now pushed forward as far as it will go. Remove the spanner so it spins nice and freely. Double check that wheel is nice and tight. And then last but not least, and people forget to do this, is making sure we pump the rear brake so that pads are engaged. because you'd be very surprised the amount of times I see people change brake pads, they forget to pump the brake afterwards, they get to the track, they hit the first corner, the corner goes that way and they go straight on because they've not pumped the brake up, and obviously the back brake doesn't engage. But that's a pretty straightforward way of demonstrating how to change your rear brake pads. Again, you can also do it a separate way. You can just do it by leaving the caliper in place on the bike. Just remove the brake pin. Same again, push the caliper against the wheel so it opens up the pistons, and you can actually change the brake pads whilst the caliper is in place like this. But bit more fiddly, bit closer inside there. But that's your two options. Obviously, I've done the most generic way, which is remove the rear wheel. But that's pretty much how to change rear brake pads.